Every employee believes the same thing about layoffs. They believe that if their performance is strong enough, they're safe. That the company has some objective system, a spreadsheet, a scoring model, a fair process, that protects the people who do good work. This belief is comforting. It's also almost completely wrong. I've spent time examining how layoff decisions actually get made inside organizations, and the process looks almost nothing like what most employees imagine. Performance is a factor, but it's rarely the deciding factor. In most layoffs, the final list is shaped by politics, by relationships, by who is in the room when the decision gets made, and by factors that have nothing to do with how well someone does their job. If you've ever watched a layoff happen and thought that doesn't make sense, they were one of the best people here, you were right. It often doesn't make sense if you're looking through the lens of performance. It makes perfect sense through a different lens entirely. Here's the first thing that almost nobody understands about layoffs: the decisions are rarely made by the people who supervise the work day to day. In most mid-size and large organizations, layoff lists are constructed in a series of meetings between senior leaders, directors, VPs, sometimes the executive team, using budget targets handed down from above. A typical instruction looks something like this: reduce headcount by 15% in this division. That number has nothing to do with individual performance. It's a financial target. The actual selection process that follows is where things get political. Each manager is asked to identify candidates from their team. But managers are not neutral evaluators in this process. They are protecting their own interests as much as anyone else in the building. A manager who feels secure in their position will sometimes protect their strongest people fiercely. A manager who feels threatened, or who is trying to prove their own value during a cost-cutting exercise, may sacrifice strong performers to demonstrate they're a team player willing to make hard decisions. So if performance isn't the deciding factor, what actually determines who ends up on the list? There are 4 factors that consistently matter more than most people realize. The first is cost relative to perceived value. Senior employees with high salaries are disproportionately vulnerable, not because they're less skilled, but because removing one senior person hits the budget target faster than removing 2 junior people. If a company needs to cut costs by a specific dollar amount, the math often favors removing fewer, more expensive people over removing more, cheaper people, regardless of who is actually more valuable to the work. The second factor is relationship insulation. Employees who have built strong personal relationships with senior decision-makers, not through manipulation, but through visibility and trust built over time, are far less likely to appear on lists, even when their performance is comparable to someone who lacks those relationships. The decision-makers protect people they know personally, often without consciously realizing that's what they're doing. The third factor is documentation asymmetry. In most layoffs, especially ones with any legal exposure, there's a parallel process happening alongside the political one. Companies need to be able to justify their decisions on paper, in case they are challenged. This means employees with documented performance issues, even minor ones, become easier targets, because their removal is easier to defend. Meanwhile, employees with clean documentation but weak political standing are sometimes deliberately given negative documentation in the weeks before a layoff specifically to create that paper trail. This happens more often than companies will ever admit. The fourth factor is replaceability of function, not person. If your specific role can be eliminated, restructured, or absorbed into someone else's job description without major disruption, you become a candidate, regardless of how well you personally perform that role. Some of the most skilled people in any organization occupy roles that are structurally easy to eliminate. And some of the least skilled people occupy roles that are structurally difficult to remove. The math runs on role structure, not individual merit. Let me walk you through a real example that illustrates how these factors combine. A mid-sized software company needed to cut 12% of its engineering staff. On paper, the company said the decision would be based on performance ratings. In reality, here's what happened. 2 senior engineers with the highest performance ratings on the team were let go. Both were among the highest paid individual contributors, and both had relatively distant relationships with the engineering director, having joined under a previous manager. Meanwhile, a mid-level engineer with average performance ratings, but who had built a close working relationship with the director through a high-visibility project the previous year, was retained. A junior engineer whose specific role, maintaining a legacy system, could not be easily absorbed by anyone else on the team was also retained, despite being relatively inexperienced, simply because eliminating that role would have created an immediate operational problem. When the final list was presented to HR, it was framed entirely around budget targets and role necessity. Performance was barely mentioned. Once you understand this, the practical implications become clear, even if they're uncomfortable. Being excellent at your job is necessary, but it has never been sufficient on its own. If you want to genuinely reduce your exposure during the next round of cuts, you need to think about the same 4 factors that decision-makers actually use. On cost relative to value, make sure your visible contribution is proportional to your compensation in the eyes of the people who control the budget, not just in your own assessment. On relationship insulation, build genuine, direct relationships with decision-makers above your immediate manager, so your value is something they understand firsthand, not something they have to take on faith. On documentation, understand that any negative feedback, however minor, has a longer institutional life than you'd expect. Address it directly and make sure your own record of contributions exists independently of what gets written about you. And on role structure, make sure your function would be genuinely difficult to absorb or eliminate, not just well performed. There's a deeper truth here that's worth sitting with. Most employees experience a layoff as something that happened to them, an external event, unpredictable, unfair, disconnected from anything they could have influenced. And in the moment, that's exactly how it feels. But when you trace the actual decision-making process backward, most layoff outcomes were shaped by conditions that existed long before the announcement. The relationships that weren't built. The visibility that wasn't established. The role that was never made indispensable. None of this is about blaming people who get laid off. Many excellent professionals lose their jobs through factors entirely outside their control, including layoffs driven by decisions made years before they even joined the company. But where individual influence does exist, it's worth recognizing it clearly. The goal isn't to become paranoid about every relationship or every piece of feedback. The goal is to understand that the system you're operating in is not the meritocracy most people assume it is, and to make deliberate choices accordingly. If you're someone who manages people, this conversation looks a little different, and it's worth addressing directly. The pressure to protect your own position during a layoff process is real, and it creates a genuine ethical tension. Sacrificing a strong performer to protect a weaker one with better relationships, or to demonstrate cooperation with leadership, is a choice that happens more often than most managers would ever admit publicly. There's no simple answer to this tension. But the managers who navigate it with the most integrity tend to do one thing consistently: they advocate as hard as they can, with whatever leverage they have, for the people whose contributions they genuinely believe in, even when it's politically uncomfortable to do so. They document contributions proactively, not defensively. They make the case for value in terms decision-makers actually respond to: cost, risk, and operational necessity, rather than relying solely on appeals to fairness. Because in a system this political, fairness alone has never been a reliable form of protection. Here's a piece of advice that sounds counterintuitive but matters enormously: stop treating layoff protection and performance excellence as the same project. They require different actions. Performance excellence means doing your actual job exceptionally well. Layoff protection means making sure the right people, in the right rooms, with the right information, understand that excellence, and means making your function structurally difficult to eliminate. Many talented professionals pour all their energy into the first and almost none into the second, then feel genuinely shocked and betrayed when a layoff doesn't reflect their actual contribution. This isn't a flaw in their character. It's a gap in their strategy. The professionals who navigate organizational instability most successfully over the long run are the ones who've internalized a simple but uncomfortable truth: doing good work and ensuring that good work translates into organizational protection are two separate skill sets. Both are learnable. Both require deliberate attention. And relying on only one of them, no matter how well you've developed it, leaves you exposed in ways you may not see coming until it's too late. The next time you hear about a layoff, whether at your own company or somewhere else, I want you to look at the list differently. Instead of asking, "Did these people deserve this?" ask a different question: what does this list reveal about what this organization actually values, versus what it claims to value? That question will teach you more about how to navigate your own career than almost anything else available to you. Layoffs are not random, and they're not purely about performance. They're a precise, if uncomfortable, window into how power, relationships, and structure actually operate inside an organization. In our next episode, we're going to look at something connected to this: why some people consistently survive every round of cuts across multiple companies, throughout their entire careers, almost as if they have some kind of organizational immunity. And what they understand that almost nobody else does. Subscribe now. Because the patterns we're uncovering in this series are not theoretical. They're operating in your organization right now, whether you've been able to see them or not.